The first signs of betrayal always whisper in the shadows of routine. I should have known. As a surgeon, I was trained to notice the smallest irregularities, the tiniest deviations that could signal catastrophe. Yet in my own life, I had become blind to the symptoms of deceit growing like a cancer in my marriage. My husband Michael and I had built what I thought was the perfect life. Both respected physicians at Boston Memorial, we shared not just a home but a dedication to healing that had drawn us together 15 years ago. Our modernist house in Brookline, with its clean lines and countless windows, seemed to mirror our transparency with each other. At least, that's what I had always believed. The change began subtly, like the first fallen leaf that heralds autumn. Michael started keeping his phone face down, the soft buzz of incoming messages punctuating our evening routine with increasing frequency. Each time I glanced his way, he would murmur, "Just work stuff, Jen," without meeting my eyes, his fingers dancing across the screen with an urgency that felt foreign to our usual peaceful evenings. As chief of cardiology, Michael had always been dedicated to his patients, but this was different. The Michael I knew would share his cases with me over dinner, his brilliant mind working through complex diagnoses as we brainstormed together. Now, our conversations felt hollow, like performing a surgery with dull instruments, technically correct but lacking precision and purpose. Another complex case? I asked one evening, watching him furiously typing on his phone while our dinner grew cold. The autumn wind rattled the windows of our dining room, and shadows from our modernist chandelier cast strange patterns across his face. "Yeah, just consulting on a difficult situation," he replied, his voice carrying that new distance that had become all too familiar. "You know how it is with liability issues these days." I did know. As head of trauma surgery, I'd dealt with my share of complicated cases and potential lawsuits. But something in his tone rang false, like a heart monitor showing an irregular rhythm. My surgical instincts, honed over thousands of operations, were screaming that something wasn't right. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing. It wasn't the deep, peaceful rhythm I'd grown accustomed to over our years together. He was awake too, the blue glow of his phone illuminating his face as he typed yet another message to his mysterious correspondent. The next morning, I made a decision. As a surgeon, I'd learned that sometimes you have to cut deep to heal. I waited until Michael left for his morning rounds, then did something I'd never imagined doing in 15 years of marriage. I picked up his tablet, the one he sometimes left at home. The password was still our anniversary, at least that hadn't changed. My hands trembled as I opened his photo gallery, a gesture that felt like violating the sacred trust between us. What I found stopped my heart more effectively than any cardiac arrest I'd ever treated. There she was. Young, beautiful, smiling intimately at the camera in dozens of photos. Some were taken in what looked like a restaurant, others in a park I recognized near the hospital. In one, she was wearing a medical coat, suggesting she worked at Boston Memorial too. But it was the way Michael looked at her in their shared photos that cut deepest. I recognized that look. It was how he used to look at me. When I confronted him that evening, his response hit me like a physical blow. "That's Sarah," he said, his voice steady but his hands gripping his phone like a lifeline. "She's my sister." "Your sister?" I repeated, the words tasting like bile in my mouth. In 15 years of marriage, through countless family holidays and shared confidences, he had never once mentioned having a sister. "Yes," he continued, meeting my gaze with an intensity that almost made me believe him. "There's a lot about my family I've never told you, Jennifer. Some things are better left in the past. But I'm a surgeon. I know the difference between a clean incision and a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding." As I watched my husband of 15 years try to suture together this implausible story, I realized that the life we'd built was infected with lies. And like any good surgeon, I knew that sometimes the only way to save the patient was to cut deeper, no matter how much it hurt. As I went to bed that night, my mind racing with questions and suspicions, I made a silent vow. I would excise this cancer of deceit from our marriage, even if it meant cutting away parts of my heart in the process. The question was, would there be anything left to save once the operation was complete? The lie about Sarah festered in my mind like an untreated wound, spreading its poison through every moment of my waking hours. As a trauma surgeon, I'd learned to trust my instincts. They'd saved countless lives on my operating table. Now, those same instincts were screaming that Michael's story was as fragile as a patient's failing pulse. I began my investigation with surgical precision. Each morning after Michael left for the hospital, I methodically dissected his past, searching for traces of this supposed sister. Our wedding photos, family gatherings, holiday cards, 15 years of shared memories, and not a single mention or glimpse of Sarah. The absence felt deliberate, like a vital organ removed without leaving a scar. The breaking point came during dinner with Michael's parents the following week. As we sat in their familiar dining room, surrounded by decades of family photos, I carefully steered the conversation toward childhood memories. "Tell me about when Michael and Sarah were young," I said, watching his mother's face with the same intensity one reserved for monitoring vital signs during critical procedures. The confusion that flickered across her features was brief but unmistakable. "Sarah?" she asked, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Who's Sarah?" I felt Michael tense beside me, his hand gripping his wine glass with enough force to whiten his knuckles. The silence that followed was like the moment before calling time of death, heavy with finality and unspoken truth. "Mom," Michael cut in smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced calm I'd heard him use with anxious patience. "I told Jennifer about Sarah. It's time." What followed was a masterclass in improvisation. Michael wove a tale about a half-sister from his father's previous relationship, a family secret kept buried for decades. His parents played along, but I could see the strain in their performance, the slight delay in their responses, the careful way they avoided details. That night, driving home in silence, I watched Michael's profile in the darkness. The man beside me was suddenly a stranger, his familiar features rearranged into someone I didn't recognize. Every case I'd ever handled in the ER had taught me that the initial presentation rarely told the whole story. You had to look deeper, past the obvious symptoms to find the true cause of the trauma. I began taking lunch breaks in different parts of the hospital, casually observing Sarah when I could find her. She worked in the cardiology department, of course she did, but something about her interactions with Michael seemed off. Their body language was intimate but guarded, like two people sharing a secret they were desperate to keep hidden. The more I watched, the more the inconsistencies piled up. Sarah's personnel file listed her age as 32, too young to be from Michael's father's previous relationship, as he'd claimed. She'd only joined Boston Memorial 6 months ago, transferring from a hospital in Chicago with glowing recommendations. Too perfect, too clean, like a medical history that's been sanitized to hide complications. One afternoon, I followed her to the hospital cafe. She sat alone, scrolling through her phone with the kind of nervous energy I recognized from patients about to receive bad news. I approached her table, my surgical mask still in place after a morning in the OR. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from her before she could refuse. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Michael's wife." The fear that flashed across her face was instant and genuine. She tried to hide it behind a smile, but I'd seen that look too many times not to recognize it, the look of someone realizing they're trapped. "Of course," she managed, her voice steady but her hands betraying her as they shredded a paper napkin. "Michael's told me so much about you." "Funny," I replied, removing my mask slowly, deliberately. "Until recently, he'd never mentioned you at all." What happened next would have been comical if it wasn't so devastating. Sarah's phone buzzed. "Michael," I was certain, and she practically fled the cafe, leaving behind her half-eaten lunch and a trail of shredded napkin pieces like breadcrumbs marking her escape. That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by patient files and surgical journals, and made a decision. If Michael wanted to play doctor with his lies, I would treat this like any other complex case. I would gather evidence, consult experts, and prepare for the most delicate operation of my career, extracting the truth from the web of deception he'd woven around our marriage. I opened my laptop and began typing, "Private Investigator Boston." The cursor blinked back at me like a patience monitor, marking the rhythm of my resolve. Michael had taught me one valuable lesson through all of this: sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we need to investigate most thoroughly. The private investigator's report landed in my inbox like a diagnosis I'd been dreading: comprehensive, clinical, and devastating in its clarity. Sarah Morton wasn't Michael's sister. She wasn't even Sarah Morton. The woman who'd infiltrated our lives was Rebecca Chen, a former patient from Michael's department who'd left Chicago under circumstances that reeked of concealed malpractice. I sat in my office at Boston Memorial, the harsh fluorescent lights casting shadows across the damning evidence spread before me. Each photograph, each document felt like another instrument on my surgical tray, tools I would use to dissect the corpse of my marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. How many times had I stood in this very room, delivering life-altering news to patients' families? Now I was both surgeon and patient, clinician and victim. The revelation carved through my defenses with the precision of a scalpel. Every shared moment with Michael now required re-examination, like reviewing old surgical footage to identify the exact moment where everything went wrong. Our morning coffees, our evening debriefs, our weekend plans, how many of these moments had been contaminated by his deception? How long had he been performing this elaborate surgery on our marriage, excising truth and transplanting lies in its place? I found myself watching him at work, observing from the surgical gallery as he performed his daily procedures. His hands moved with their usual confidence, his voice steady as he directed his team through complex cardiac operations. How could someone so dedicated to saving lives be so skilled at destroying one? Mine. The weight of knowledge pressed against my chest like a tumor, growing larger with each passing day. I began cataloging the subtle signs I'd missed, compiling a medical history of our relationship's decline. The late-night texts. The sudden business trips. The way he'd changed his phone's password last month, claiming it was hospital policy. Each symptom pointed to a malignant diagnosis I'd been too trusting to consider. One evening, I followed him after his shift ended. The autumn rain fell in sheets, obscuring my view as I tracked his car through Boston's winding streets. He pulled up to an apartment building in Back Bay, elegant, discreet, exactly the kind of place where secrets could fester undisturbed. 20 minutes later, Rebecca emerged, her scrubs replaced by a black dress that spoke of intentions far removed from professional consultation. I sat in my car, rain drumming against the roof, and felt something crystallize within me. The woman who had trusted blindly, who had accepted explanations like a patient swallowing bitter medicine, began to fade. In her place emerged someone harder, someone who understood that sometimes healing requires calculated destruction. The next day, I reached out to an old colleague in Chicago. Dr. Patricia Martinez had been my resident during my fellowship, and now sat on the hospital board there. Her voice over the phone carried the weight of shared understanding, another woman who'd navigated the treacherous waters of medical politics and personal betrayal. "The case you're asking about," she said, her words measured like carefully administered medication, "was sealed as part of a settlement. But off the record, your husband made a serious error during a routine procedure." Rebecca Chen, she was the patient's daughter. She threatened to go public, to destroy his reputation. The hospital paid to keep it quiet. The pieces clicked into place with the finality of a rib spreader locking open. Rebecca hadn't followed Michael to Boston for love or lust, she'd followed him for revenge, or money, or both. And Michael, my brilliant, respected husband, was dancing to her tune like a puppet on invisible sutures. That night, I watched him sleep, studying his face as I had countless times before. But now I saw him with new eyes, not as the man I'd loved for 15 years, but as a patient presenting with severe ethical decay. The diagnosis was clear. The only question remaining was the course of treatment. In surgery, Timing is everything. Move too quickly, and you risk catastrophic bleeding. Move too slowly, and infection sets in. I'd spent my career perfecting this balance, learning when to cut and when to wait. Now, as I laid beside the stranger who wore my husband's face, I began to formulate my surgical plan. Tomorrow, I would begin gathering evidence, hospital records, phone logs, security footage. I would build my case methodically, layer by layer, like closing a complex wound. But first, I needed to understand my enemy. Not Michael, he was merely the compromised tissue. No, I needed to understand Rebecca Chen, the real pathogen in this diseased situation. I rolled over, my back to Michael's sleeping form, and opened my phone to the private investigator's message. Ready to dig deeper, I typed. Focus on Chicago. Find everything. The blue light illuminated my face in the darkness, casting shadows that felt like war paint. The woman who had once been content to heal was preparing to wound, and the transformation felt like awakening from a long anesthesia into a sharper, clearer reality. The truth, when it finally emerged, had the devastating precision of a perfectly aimed scalpel. Rebecca Chen's story unfolded before me in a series of digital breadcrumbs, each one leading deeper into a labyrinth of calculated manipulation. The private investigator's latest report sat heavy in my hands, its contents burning through my professional detachment like acid through tissue. 3 years ago, Michael had performed a routine valve replacement on Rebecca's mother. The procedure should have been straightforward, the kind of operation he could do in his sleep. But something went wrong. A mistake was made, covered up, buried under layers of bureaucratic scar tissue. The patient survived, but with complications that would shadow her remaining years. Rebecca, armed with evidence of Michael's error, saw an opportunity. Not for justice, but for systematic extraction. I traced her strategy with a surgeon's appreciation for technical excellence. She'd orchestrated her transfer to Boston Memorial with tactical precision, positioning herself within Michael's department like a slow-growing cancer. Each move had been calculated, from the carefully cultivated friendship to the strategically leaked hints of their shared past. The photographs I discovered weren't evidence of an affair, they were documentation, insurance, proof of private meetings that could be interpreted a dozen damning ways. The revelation hit me with the force of cardiac arrest. Michael wasn't having an affair. He was being bled dry, one threatening text at a time, one carefully orchestrated, coincidental, meeting after another. The photos were her scalpel, pressed against the throat of his career. Each payment, each concession, was another drop of lifeblood draining from our shared future. In the sterile confines of my office, I reviewed security footage from the hospital parking garage. The timestamps matched the private investigator's notes, regular meetings, always in shadowed corners, always with Michael emerging looking more haunted than before. I watched my husband age months in weeks, his confident surgeon's posture crumbling under the weight of perpetual threat. The rage that filled me wasn't the hot, blind fury of a betrayed wife. Instead, it was something colder, more precise, the calculated anger of a surgeon identifying a malignancy that needed to be excised. Rebecca had invaded our lives with the methodical precision of a parasitic infection, but she'd made one critical error: she'd assumed Michael was the only doctor in this equation. I spent that evening in my home office, methodically building a case like preparing for a complex surgery. Hospital records, security logs, financial transactions, each piece of evidence carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. The story they told was clear: Rebecca Chen was orchestrating a sophisticated extortion scheme, and my husband, the brilliant cardiac surgeon, was merely her latest victim. When Michael came home that night, I watched him move through our house like a ghost, his shoulders bent under invisible weights. The sight sparked something new in me, not just anger at his deception, but a fierce, protective rage at what had been done to him. He'd chosen silence over honesty, had tried to excise this tumor alone rather than trust me with the truth. But now, watching him check his phone for the 100th time, jumping at every notification, I understood the depth of his fear. Long day. I asked, my voice carefully modulated to hide the storm beneath. He nodded, avoiding my eyes with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown accustomed to concealing pain. Just the usual complications, he replied, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. I let him retreat to his study, watching as he closed the door on another evening of solitary suffering. The Michael I'd married would never have hidden from me like this, would never have carried such a burden alone. Rebecca hadn't just threatened his career, she'd systematically dismantled the foundation of trust our marriage was built on. In the darkness of our kitchen, I opened my laptop one final time. The evidence was clear, the diagnosis complete. Rebecca Chen wasn't just extorting my husband, she was performing the same operation on other doctors across the country. My investigator had uncovered a pattern, similar accusations, similar threats, similar payoffs. She was a professional predator, targeting physicians with spotless records and comfortable lives, leveraging their fear of scandal into a steady stream of payments. Tomorrow, I would begin my counterattack. Not with threats or violence, but with the precise, methodical strategy of a surgeon planning a life-saving procedure. Rebecca thought she was the hunter, but she'd overlooked a crucial detail. Every surgeon knows that sometimes healing requires you to cut deep, to cause controlled damage in service of ultimate recovery. As I closed my laptop, a new text illuminated Michael's phone on the counter. The screen showed just enough of Rebecca's message to reveal her latest demand. I let the rage wash through me, cold and clarifying. She wanted to play doctor. Fine. I would show her what it truly means to be under the knife. The plan crystallized in my mind with the clarity of a perfect surgical approach. Each step mapped out with the precision that had saved countless lives on my operating table, but this time, I wasn't fighting death, I was dissecting vengeance to its cleanest, most effective form. I arranged the meeting with Rebecca through anonymous channels, constructing my trap with the same meticulous attention I'd give to a complex thoracic procedure. The private conference room at the Langham Hotel would serve as my operating theater, its elegant neutrality the perfect backdrop for what was to come. Like preparing surgical instruments, I laid out my evidence in precise order: bank statements, surveillance photos, witness testimonies. Each piece a carefully honed tool waiting to perform its specific function. The November rain painted rivulets across the conference room's vast windows as I waited, each droplet a timer counting down to Rebecca's arrival. My reflection in the glass showed someone I barely recognized. Gone was the trusting wife, the compassionate healer. In her place stood someone forged in the crucible of betrayal, tempered by weeks of calculated planning. When Rebecca entered, her confidence wrapped around her like expensive perfume. I saw what Michael had faced these past months. She moved with the practiced grace of a predator, each gesture calculated to intimidate. Her surprise at finding me instead of Michael flickered across her face like a cardiac arrhythmia, brief but telling. "Dr. Walsh," she said, recovering quickly, though I noted the slight tremor in her hand as she placed her designer bag on the table. "I was expecting your husband." "Were you?" I replied, my voice carrying the same measured calm I use when delivering critical diagnoses. "Like you were expecting Dr. Harrison in Seattle? Or Dr. Patel in Chicago?" The change in her expression was surgical in its precision, from controlled confidence to momentary panic and back again. I'd hit an artery, and we both knew it. "I don't know what Michael has told you," she began, reaching for the handle of her bag, "but I suggest you carefully consider your next words." "Michael hasn't told me anything," I said, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. "He doesn't know I'm here. But others have been quite informative." I watched her scan the documents, her composure cracking like ribs under emergency chest compressions. Every photo, every bank statement, every transcript of her previous extortion attempts landed like calculated incisions in her carefully constructed facade. 6 doctors in 3 states, I continued, my words cutting through her silence. All with spotless records until they encountered you or your mother. All suddenly making suspicious payments. All living in fear of career-ending accusations. It's an impressive operation, methodical, precise. Almost surgical in its execution. You don't understand, Rebecca countered, but her voice had lost its predatory edge. What your husband did was a mistake, I interrupted, my tone sharp as a scalpel. A tragic surgical complication that was fully disclosed and legally settled. But you've turned it into an industry, haven't you? Trading on that single incident to destroy other doctors' lives. Tell me, how many families have you bled dry with your threats? How many careers have you held hostage? The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows like a rapid heartbeat. In the storm's gray light, I saw Rebecca's mask finally slip completely, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. She reached for her phone, her lifeline to control, but I was faster. Before you try to threaten me or my husband, I said, sliding another document forward, you should know that every piece of evidence I've gathered has already been sent to the medical boards of Illinois, Massachusetts, and Washington. They're very interested in patterns of fraudulent malpractice claims. You're bluffing, she whispered, but her eyes betrayed her. She was scanning for exits, like a cancer realizing it had been detected too late. I'm a trauma surgeon, Rebecca. I don't bluff. I assess, I decide, and I act. Right now, you have exactly one chance to survive this: sign the confession I've prepared, return every dollar you've extorted, and disappear from our lives. Otherwise, the next conversation you have will be with the FBI's healthcare fraud division. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shifting power. I watched her world collapse in real time, like watching necrotic tissue being severed from healthy flesh. When she finally reached for the confession with trembling hands, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the cold certainty of a surgeon who knows she's excised a tumor completely. As Rebecca signed her name, her tears falling on the document like drops of blood on surgical gauze, I realized that this moment wasn't just about saving Michael. It was about cauterizing a wound in my own psyche, burning away the last traces of naive trust that had allowed this cancer to grow in our lives. The hardest surgeries aren't the ones that test your technical skill, they're the ones that force you to rebuild what's broken, to find healing in the aftermath of devastation. As I stood in our darkened kitchen that night, waiting for Michael to return home, I felt the weight of that truth settle into my bones like surgical steel. The signed confession sat on our granite countertop, its pages reflecting the dim light like a scalpel catching the ore spots. Rebecca's signature, trembling and defeated, marked the excision of a cancer that had nearly destroyed us both. But now came the most delicate part of the operation, reconstructing what remained of our marriage from the trauma of deception. When Michael's key turned in the lock, I noticed how he entered our home like a patient approaching a dreaded diagnosis, shoulders hunched, steps hesitant, eyes already seeking escape routes. The sight pierced me with an understanding sharper than any surgical tool. We had both been operating in isolation, each performing our separate procedures without trusting in the possibility of collaborative healing. Sit down, Michael, I said, my voice carrying the same steady authority I use in the trauma bay. It's time we performed this surgery together. His confusion melted into recognition as I laid out the evidence of my investigation. With each document I revealed, each layer of Rebecca's extortion scheme I exposed, I watched the crushing weight of secrecy lift from his shoulders like post-operative bandages being removed to reveal healing beneath. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, though the question felt more like an incision into my own heart than his. Did you think I wouldn't understand the impossible choice between protecting your reputation and protecting our life together? I thought I could contain the infection, he whispered, professional detachment crumbling into raw vulnerability. Every payment, every meeting, I told myself I was just buying time until I could find a solution. But she kept cutting deeper, demanding more. The shame of that original mistake became nothing compared to the shame of hiding it from you. In the silence that followed, I heard the monitors of our marriage beeping steadily, no longer flatlining but not yet stable. The prognosis would depend on how well we could graft new trust onto the wounds of the past. Rebecca won't be troubling us, or any other doctors, again, I said, sliding her confession across the counter like passing a crucial instrument to a fellow surgeon. "The evidence has been logged, the authorities notified. The bleeding has been stopped." Michael's hands trembled as he read the document, his surgeon's composure cracking like a sterile field compromised. When he looked up, I saw tears tracking down his face like surgical prep solution, cleaning away the last traces of pretense. "I performed the original surgery on her mother," he said, each word measured like careful sutures. "I made a mistake, yes, but I disclosed it, addressed it, made it right through proper channels. But Rebecca, she found a way to turn that single error into an endless source of power. Every time I thought I'd finally satisfied her demands, she'd find another angle, another threat. She was a skilled operator, I acknowledged, letting professional admiration color my clinical assessment. But she made a critical mistake. She assumed you were isolated, that a surgeon's pride would keep you suffering in silence forever. She never considered that you had a partner equally skilled in excising diseased tissue from otherwise healthy systems." The dawn began to seep through our kitchen windows, casting everything in the pale blue light reminiscent of early morning rounds. We sat together, two surgeons who had spent their lives healing others, finally turning their combined expertise toward mending their own wounded relationship. "The hospital board meets next week," I said, outlining our recovery plan like mapping post-operative care. "With Rebecca's confession and the evidence of her broader extortion scheme, they'll understand that you were a victim, not a perpetrator. Your reputation will heal, given time and proper care." Michael reached across the counter, his hand finding mine with the precision of countless shared surgeries. "And us?" he asked, the question carrying all the weight of a critical diagnosis. "What's the prognosis for us?" I interlaced my fingers with his, feeling the strength that comes from knowing you've survived the worst that fate can suture into your life. "Like any major surgery, recovery will take time. We'll need to rebuild trust one layer at a time, watching for signs of infection or rejection. But the procedure was successful, we've removed the disease that was killing us. Now we focus on healing." Together, we stood in the strengthening light of a new day, our shared scars a testament to survival rather than weakness. The operating theater of our marriage lay sterilized and ready for reconstruction, and this time, we would perform the delicate work of healing as we always should have, as partners, as equals, as surgeons who understood that sometimes the deepest cuts are necessary for the strongest recovery. In the months that followed, we would establish a foundation to help other medical professionals facing similar threats, turning our personal trauma into a source of systemic healing. Because that's what surgeons do, we take what's broken, what's bleeding, what's threatened by darkness, and we find a way to make it whole again, one careful suture at a time.